My life ended last Wednesday, the day of my husband's funeral. The funeral itself was like a waking nightmare. I've never felt so numb as when I watched the coffin lowered into the ground. The coffin that contained Mark. I'm the one that feels like a corpse. I should be the one being buried, not him. What's the point of anything after this? I barely managed to toss in my pathetic handful of dirt. Mark was my whole world. We had been so happy together. That's why his suicide was so shocking. Our home, which had been my oasis, now feels empty and meaningless. I hate it. I haven't cleaned in over a week, and people keep showing up. The last thing I want right now is human interaction. I finally just stopped answering the door. They're still stopping by, but they just leave the food on our porch. Casseroles, pies, trays of cold cuts, as if one woman could ever possibly eat all this. I feel nauseous just looking at it. What I need, really, is a drink. I heard the doorbell as I rummaged around in our liquor cabinet. I ignored it, but it just kept ringing. I peeked through the blinds. It's Karen, my mother-in-law, the absolute last person I want to see right now. Don't you know I want to be alone? I grudgingly let her in. I looked like a disheveled mess, but whatever. Karen, don't get me started. I hated this woman, and the feeling was mutual. She did everything she could to make my life an absolute hell, all for taking her precious son away from her. Karen sat down at the table. She'd brought a plate of brownies, and she pushed one towards me on a napkin. Sweetie, you really need to eat something. I admitted she was right. I pulled the brownie towards me and took a bite. She smiled slightly as she sipped her coffee. Yeah, I'm eating your dumb brownie. Are you happy, Karen? Your brownies are my favorite, I said between mouthfuls. She looked at me for a long while. I know, she said slowly. It's a pity you didn't eat any of that batch I sent over last week. I made them especially for you. I frowned. What brownies? I guess you didn't get to taste them, she replied. Mark got to them first. I felt sick. Don't worry, she continued. I made sure to increase the dose. Wouldn't want you to suffer. At first, I wanted you out of the picture. But now, I just want to finish the job. In retrospect, it should have been obvious from the start that there was something going on. It was my first time renting an apartment, but even I thought that the landlord was eager for me to move in as soon as possible. The rent was ridiculously low for the area, the apartment itself was in pristine condition, and the whole process from touring the apartment to moving only took about a week. Nothing like that comes without a catch. Apartment 311 was a pleasant place to live at first. It had 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, and since I lived alone, that meant I got to convert 1 bedroom into my own office space. It came with a handful of paintings already, so it didn't even have the off-putting liminal feeling that some empty apartments have. The only immediate downside I could tell from the start was that there was a slight smell in the living room from time to time. It wasn't anything too noticeable, but you would occasionally get a faint whiff of some sort of musty odor. I was living in apartment 311 for a couple weeks before I noticed anything was wrong. It started out with simple stuff, like various knickknacks being placed on the wrong shelves, or snacks and small objects going missing, things like that. Once or twice, I had found the fridge left open. These things would only happen when I was asleep, and it made me feel like I was going crazy. There was no way anyone could be breaking into my apartment just to steal some useless crap and move around some collectibles. The door was locked whenever I went to bed, and even if someone hypothetically had the key, I always made sure to bolt the door as well. I considered getting some security cameras set up, but I balked at the price when I looked into that possibility. Though the apartment was admittedly cheap between rent and utilities, I still couldn't afford to set up an entire security system. I tried to put it out of mind, assuming that maybe I was just sleepwalking or getting up for a midnight snack and forgetting by the next morning. I'd never been an easy sleeper. I was often prone to night terrors and other disturbances, which had only gotten worse now that I was in an unfamiliar environment. Of all the sleep problems I've experienced, by far the least pleasant is sleep paralysis. It used to happen fairly rarely, maybe once every 2 to 3 months, but after moving into the apartment, it became an almost weekly occurrence. Now, usually, my sleep paralysis is fairly mild. I find myself unable to move, eyes open, and I find it difficult to breathe. Sometimes I feel like there's a presence in the room with me, but before I moved, I had never experienced any form of hallucinations, visual or otherwise. I'd never seen a ghost, a monster, a hag, or any other sort of entity while I was paralyzed. It was only ever a sense of dread and total paralysis of the body. That changed about the same time I noticed the missing food and misplaced objects. As usual, it felt like I had woken up but couldn't move a single muscle. It was hard to breathe, and I had this awful feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to calm myself down, to remind myself that I had been through this before, and it always wound up okay. But something felt different. It was then that I noticed the door to my bedroom slowly opening, inch by inch. I could hear the creak of the hinges as it swung inward. Someone or something was coming into my room. He peeked his head around first, dull eyes reflecting the faint glow of moonlight from my bedroom window. He was bald with pale, flaky skin. I wanted to scream when I saw his expression, but I was still a prisoner of my own body. The man had a forced, rictus grin on his face, chipped yellow teeth clenched tightly together, grinding against one another. I watched in horror as the rest of the man's body slowly passed into the room, tiptoeing as if he were creeping up behind someone in a cartoon. The man was utterly emaciated, almost skeletal in appearance, and covered in sores and pockmarks. He was stark naked and smeared in dirt and filth. I could do nothing but watch as he slowly inched ever closer towards me, until I could feel his hot breath upon my face. It smelled like the musty odor I sometimes detected in the living room. Not once did I see his expression change. He didn't even blink as he stared at me, and I could feel hatred radiating off of him like heat from a furnace. He just stood there, looking at me for what felt like hours. Eventually, he turned around and slowly sneaked back out of the room, gently shutting the door behind him. A few minutes later, I started to be able to move again, the paralysis wearing off as my body started to wake up properly. I had to call in sick to my job that day. The experience was such a shock to me that there was no way in hell I'd be able to get any work done. I spent a good hour just checking every room to make sure I was entirely alone. I searched in the closet, underneath the sinks, in my office, anywhere I thought that someone could be hiding. When I found nothing, I managed to convince myself it was all a hallucination, that I was safe. Things continued about the same for a while after that. Objects still went missing from time to time. The smell in the living room stayed just as musty as it ever was. And about every week or so, I'd have another sleep paralysis incident. Of course, now, every time I did experience sleep paralysis, I'd have to see my unwanted visitor again. I named him Jimmy, to try and reduce the terror a little bit. Putting a silly name to a horrifying face helped lessen my fears slightly. As far as sleep paralysis hallucinations went, Jimmy wasn't too bad once I started to get used to him. He never touched me or sat on my chest like some people's nightmares did. He just stood and stared. It is still deeply unpleasant, mind you, but I felt lucky that it was a consistent kind of unpleasantness, at least. Then I found the photograph. I noticed it underneath a pile of papers while I was doing some cleaning up. A picture of two women embracing in front of a waterfall. I didn't recognize either of the women, and I assumed it must have been from the previous tenant. I texted the landlord, Greg, and asked if he still had the old tenant's phone number so I could give her a call. He obliged, and within a few minutes I was calling her. She picked up after a couple rings, sounding slightly exasperated.
Hello, this is Rebecca. Who is this?
Hi, my name is Flora. I'm currently the tenant of apartment 311. I think that you may have left a photograph behind when you moved. I was wondering if you'd want to pick it up, or I could mail it to you or something. There was a long pause on the other end of the phone. Hello? I asked.
You need to get out of that apartment. You're not safe.
I honestly didn't have any response but to laugh. Is this some kind of joke? I asked her between chuckles. I heard her sigh with frustration.
It's not a joke. I'm serious. Things have been going missing, right?
That got my attention. How did you know that?
It happened with me too. My girlfriend and I kept noticing things being moved or disappearing while we were asleep. Little things mostly, snacks, trinkets, nothing major. Now, I never saw this, but my girlfriend swears one time when she got up in the middle of the night to get a glass of water, she saw this naked man just staring at her. He was covered in sores and looked more like a corpse than a person. She woke me up and we called the police, of course, but they didn't find anything, I think.
Rebecca paused for a moment, choosing her words. What is it? I asked, increasingly panicked. I began to worry that Jimmy was more than just a simple hallucination.
I think 311 is haunted. We asked around to some of the other residents, and apparently the last guy to live there just disappeared. Our best guess is that he must have died and his spirit just never left. My girlfriend is into some occult stuff, so she tried a cleansing ritual or something like that, but it didn't work. Things kept disappearing, and eventually we just decided to move.
I hung up the phone. It was rude, sure, but I was just so shocked that I didn't know what to do. At the very least, I began to understand why I got this apartment for so cheap. I found myself just sitting on the couch for a while, occasionally getting a whiff of the musty smell. I stared blankly at a painting on the wall, one of the ones which was already there when I first moved in. It depicted a woman in a white dress sitting underneath a tree reading a book. I couldn't tell what was making me so focused on it. It seemed utterly unrelated to what was happening. Eventually, I snapped out of it and went into my office to do some research. After a little bit of digging, I found out some information regarding the tenant who lived here before Rebecca, the one who disappeared. Apparently, one of his coworkers put out a missing persons report 6 months ago. His name was Michael Hansen, and I gasped when I saw a photograph of him. He looked exactly like Jimmy, albeit not so emaciated and filthy. I hastily packed some of my things and made arrangements to stay at a friend's house for a couple nights, telling them that my apartment had a roach problem and the landlord needed to fumigate it. I called into work and gave them some sob story about an uncle dying, enough to get time off for a few days. With no more distractions from the ghosts of Michael Hansen, I slept soundly on my friend's couch, unbothered by any sleep paralysis. The next 2 days were spent researching. I checked out dozens of books on folklore and the occult from the local library, scoured paranormal internet forums, and even watched a few episodes of some cheesy ghost hunting TV show. I was determined to figure out a way to put the spirit of Michael Hansen to rest. The stories were all wildly different, with countless potential solutions to my problem. Some sources said salt was a surefire way to banish spirits. Others said iron was a good ghost repellent, but most simply said I should give up and move. However, one myth piqued my interest. According to some beliefs, the spirits of the unquiet dead could be tied to objects from their life, binding them to the place where the object resided. If the object which their soul was bound to was destroyed, it freed their spirit and they could move on to the afterlife. I remembered the paintings. I had assumed that they were put there by the landlord, but it was just as possible that they were left behind by Michael. I arrived back to the apartment, determined to grab the paintings and burn them, laying Michael Hansen's soul to rest, once and for all. I felt like some sort of hero, a badass monster hunter who saved the day with her intuition and a little bit of book smarts. One by one, I pulled the paintings off the walls. Putting them in a cardboard box, I made a mental note to buy some lighter fluid on the way to the empty lot, where I had planned to burn them. I approached the final painting, the one which showed a woman in a white dress beneath a tree. I pulled it off the wall and recoiled as the musty smell increased in intensity. Staring in confusion, I saw a small rectangular hole where the painting used to be, about 4 feet off the ground and 2 feet by 2 feet in length and width. I shuddered in fear, remembering that Michael's body was never found. Perhaps he was murdered, his corpse hidden in the walls by some unknown assailant. I nervously flicked on my flashlight, peered within the hole, and screamed. I ran out of apartment 311 as fast as I could before calling the police, sobbing with terror. I had been prepared to find a body, maybe cut up into little pieces and wrapped in duct tape. I was ready for death and decay and rot. There's something fascinating about ghosts. Something somehow romantic about the notion that part of someone could live on, even after death. There's nothing romantic about seeing the clenched tooth grimace of Michael Hansen glaring at me with hate as he stood in the small section of hollow wall which he had been living in for the past 6 months. So far, I've been on 3 dates. 3 different people, 3 different dates. The first person was Max, exceptionally tall and slim. We went out to a restaurant and talked all night about things that I can't recall. He presented himself in a charming manner, subtly flirting with me and yet still not being overtly forward. We both enjoyed the night and made plans to catch up sometime in the near future. He was found early the next day, slumped over a garbage bin in an alleyway. His legs were cut off and leaned against his body, the blood trailing down his back. His heart was removed from his body and was never found. Needless to say, that shook me. I'd never had a death impact me that hard. The gruesomeness of it all felt like a punch to the gut. I felt as if I was stuck in a rut with no way of clambering out. Then I met Evan. He was of middling size, but extremely intelligent and humorous. He never failed to make me laugh. We went to the cinemas for a first date and had a blast. He was found at home, sprawled on the floor. His scalp was removed from his head, and his brain was cut in half and left by his side. Evan's heart was also missing. The incisions were perfectly straight, cutting in ways that a simple knife wouldn't be able to do. One death could be written off as a coincidence. Things like these do happen. But 2? Something else was going on, and the correlating factor seemed to be dating me. And so, when Matthew asked me out, I was hesitant. But he was persistent. He knew what had happened to my other dates and was confident that he could take care of himself. He was a mountain of a man, after all. We ordered in pizza at his house and watched Netflix. Afterwards, he took my virginity. Leaving his house, I felt happy and fulfilled, but worried, very worried. He was found outside a gym, his torso cut in half and his heart removed. The police began to question me more. 3 suspicious deaths, all related to me. I retreated inside myself and rarely left the house for anything. Life became bleak and worthless. Everything just seemed meaningless. I opened my door one day to a bouquet of flowers, let out a half-hearted smile. Someone was trying to cheer me up, probably a worried family member. Touched by the thoughtfulness, I picked up the flowers and tried to find a vase to place them in. As I was walking through my house, 3 pieces of paper fluttered out of the flowers and onto the ground. I picked them up and took a closer look at them. On each paper was a Polaroid photo of a human heart, and on the back of each photo was a message scribbled in pen. Only my heart belongs to you. For some background, I've always been able to understand animals, but I never knew it was an ability and I thought I was going insane. My earliest memory of my ability was when my parents brought home a rescue dog as a gift, after I had begged them for a puppy. And then the dog started telling me he was going to kill me if I mistreated him like his previous owners. That's when I burst into tears. My parents assumed it was me being scared until I told them what he'd said, and their faces showed a concerning look I only grew to become all too familiar with. Shortly after, I was thrown from psychologist to psychologist, becoming an object of research for varying antipsychotics, as the voices never went away. It was only in my early teens that I really started to listen. I was at the tail end of my rebellious streak and had unofficially been off my medication, and on my walks to school I'd hear all manner of things, from birds planning how they'd build their nests to the ants having orders barked at them from their strict regiment and loyal to their queen. I even got to know some regulars. There was a old dog that would sit on the porch of a house on my route named Gus. He told me his actual name was Tom and went into great detail about his life and how he was briefly astray before being taken in. It's not all it's made up to be, though. People still thought I was crazy when they caught me chatting to various bugs on the wall or having more profound interactions with pets beyond the condescending "who's a good boy" spiel. Once I was out of school and in the workplace, I chose to ignore the animals I came across, which became increasingly difficult as I'd gotten to know all the creatures in my immediate vicinity, and I couldn't afford to move away, so I always had a handful of voices calling for me on my commute, and it was like I was right back to being insane. A full year passed like this, ignoring the animals I had come to know and appreciate. I got along fine until they all stopped talking to me altogether. And it was only then that I thought about what I'd done. I'd taken away their only bridge of communication between their world and ours, their only way to be really understood, and this gave me a change of heart. So, on my day off, I went out and tried to talk to as many animals as I could to re-establish our connection, and offer back what I'd ripped from them. But I heard nothing. I hadn't noticed it before, but the world was more silent than I'd ever known it to be. But through my ignorance, I never noticed. I ran to every creature and animal I saw, desperate to help, to listen, to hear something, but all I got back was stern silence and several pleas to stop harassing people's pets. I got so desperate that I went back to Tom's porch, in hopes that the old boy had pushed through the years and could be the voice of reason. But he wasn't there. Obviously, he had passed. No dog could have lived as long, especially one who was already as old as him. However, there was another, more spry-looking hound in Tom's old spot, so I approached him. Again, I was met with silence and decided to just rant to the dog. After all, it wasn't going to stop me, was it? I went for ages, tearing up about my guilt, how I know what I'd done, and begged for forgiveness. Then I heard something, whispered quietly underneath a breath. I turned to the hound to listen closer, and could just barely make out what he was saying. You take from us, we take from you. I was taken aback and walked away slowly. The dog never looked at me, but I'm glad. As creepy as it was, I didn't want to face this thing head on. I walked home dejected and hardly noticed the now increasing cacophony around me that was the noise I'd been missing for years. But it was off. It was in unison, all of them repeating the same phrase. You take from us, we take from you. It followed me home, more and more voices adding to the terrifying symphony as animals flocked to my location. I made it home, and am now putting this post out. My house is surrounded, and there's more voices joining by the minute. What do they want to take from me? Sally sells seashells down by the seashore. Whippity wine, that meme is now mine. Are you feeling it now, Mr. Krabs? I don't know what I'm doing, to be honest. These are supposed to be my vocal warm-ups. If you're hearing these, it's because I'm dumb and silly. I don't know. I may or may not put these in. I'm living that live, laugh, love lifestyle. You know what I'm saying? Gamers. Jesus Christ. Let's just, yeah, that's enough of this.